something development related in 1 minute. I also created this VSCode.pro course. If you want to step up your programming skill set or how you can code a lot more in less time, definitely check out this course. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Enough about me already. You're here to talk about Jamstack and talking about yourself. Okay, let's move on to what I'm here to talk about. Today, I'm talking about Cloudycam.dev. It's actually a Cloudinaries developer activation that I built last. To take a look at this activation, this is what it actually looks like. So we go to all of these conferences and different meetups. For example, here is this Jamstack conference London that we went to last year. We have an actual physical photo booth there where we take your pictures and generate these demo pages, which you see right now in front of you. For example, a particular demo page looks just like this, where I explain what Clouding can do for you. It has a very simple transformation-based URL API. For example, if you say W_500, your image is going to be 500 pixels in width. And if you say quality auto and format auto, it would generate auto format, the best format for your user. For example, WebP might be the best format for Chrome, but not for Mozilla Firefox. And it kind of goes ahead and figures these things out on its own. And then in the demo page, we showcase these images that we took. A professional photographer we have there who is taking your pictures. And I also kind of build these demos on how you can use these different URL parameters to do something like this, put text over your images or do funky stuff with your images or whatnot. For example, you could also build these awesome cool looking image effects and whatnot. Anywho, back in action, this is actually, Cloudycam is actually an Internet of Things. We have a real life actual camera DSLR connected to our setup. And I was the prime architect of this project. I designed and developed this entire thing, the API, the architectural designs. They were on my code. And I ended up choosing Jamstack, which is what I'm going to kind of explain in this entire talk, why and what I did there. Also, this is a progressive web app. You can actually use it offline or some of it. I love progressive web apps, so why not? Okay, so let's talk about the project requirements. So the project requirements for this project were really simple. You take a picture, you upload it to Cloudinary, and you build a demo page. At the moment there, I was thinking easy peasy, lemon squeezy. But I'm this developer. I spent a lot of part of my career building awesome developer experience. And a good developer experience, I believe, comes from an equilibrium or a balance between a good developer experience and a good operational experience. I believe if your product just has a good developer experience, it is not going to be successful if it does not have a good operational experience at the same time, both for your consumers, which those could be developers, or for observers, who are just in the orbit of your application or your product or your SaaS company and kind of are observing how people are operating around your company or around with your product. I think these two things working together can improve your product really well. So what started to happen was, as I told you, I had built this website, this developer activation with a Jamstack. And most importantly, in Jamstack, you generate these pages pretty much statically. So let's say if you have 600 demo pages, what would happen if you add another demo page to it is the builder would just again run, and it will take about 2 or 3 minutes for all of these pages to be generated again because of the addition of a new page. And that is a less than optimal, developer and operational experience. Because, for example, imagine you come to our photographer and the photographer takes your picture. And then you come to me and ask, Wes, when am I going to get these pictures? I think all of this thing would take about 15 or so seconds. Whereas our static site generator is still working out its way in generating your demo. What am I supposed to tell you then? That is sort of what started happening at our photo booth. There would be this huge traffic of developers waiting for their demo pages to be built. And that was not a good developer experience or a good operational experience per se. So I ended up with this budget of 15 seconds. I had to build a new demo page in less than 15 seconds. That was a hard requirement. And then these requirements kind of started to grow. For example, we had these multiple demos out of one particular event working on something, working on generating your demo pages simultaneously. And to, make it more complex, we then started to have simultaneous events with multiple demos at multiple events working simultaneously. This kind of grew out of hand really quickly. And this was, I felt at the moment, this was my developer experience at the time. I felt like, okay, this Jamstack idea is good, but I'm unable to scale it. And Jamstack is about performance. And if a Jamstack application becomes a laggy, really slow stack as you start to scale, you kind of start to wonder what the community is excited about. is it, is Jamstack only helpful if you're building a small marketing site and not something that is dynamic, not something that is your blog? What is really happening here? You see, I had to make a lot of decisions again. What kind of front end am I going to use? The backend I'm going to use? How I'm going to produce, the documentation of it now? If you don't know it yet, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed at the time. So here's what I did. I started to work on the details of what is actually Jamstack. Jamstack is not actually stack. This is what I found out. Jamstack is this idea of a stack. It is still in its infant phase. It is still evolving, and it needs your help. It needs my help to become what it should be. The idea is just that you use JavaScript, APIs, and Mark. Why? For example, JavaScript I consider as a really good language, a really good programming language that is sometimes fun to use. I also believe that JavaScript has a good deal of high-paying jobs, and I consider myself a futurist. I want to live on the cutting edge of technology. I build and demo or open source stuff that is really new to the community. And that is sort of where Jamstack exists. It's sort of the cutting edge thingy using, JavaScript APIs and markup. And JavaScript kind of helps me be this futurist because I believe JavaScript is running after really cutting edge solutions. We are changing the language itself on and off in other amazing features. Whereas API could be anything, an application programmable interface. At the very crux of it, an API is like a waiter. For example, imagine you go to a restaurant and the chef is in the kitchen and you're sitting out there in their, dining area. To order your food from the chef, what you do is the waiter comes to you, especially if it is not a fast food restaurant, a waiter comes to you and that waiter gives you the, that recipe, the menu, where you can see all of the dishes that a chef in the kitchen is going to make for you. Then you tell your decision to that waiter that, okay, I'm going to eat this thing. And then that waiter takes your demands to the kitchen, to the chef, and gets that dish built, or gets that dish cooked, and then brings it back. So in this entire scenario, that waiter is actually an API, which is allowing you, the customer, the client, and the chef, the server, to communicate between each other. So in API, what happens is we generally have these endpoints that are built by these awesome backend engineers. In 2020, nowadays, what has started happening is that I personally believe that API has started to becoming, for example, API right now is a function to UI. UI kind of dictates what API should look like. It's not the other way around. And that is sort of where Graphql comes in. Instead of going back and forth with your backend engineers, asking for more endpoints with different kind of data, what you can actually do is you can use GraphQL and use the existing endpoints to create multiple resolvers that will resolve your queries the way you want without having to hit multiple endpoints at the same time or, kind of really growing these backend folks or dev folks and fighting with them for having an API that would change as soon as your UI changes. So that's API. And then the third component of Jamstack is markup. I think this is the most ignored component. I don't know why, but I really love Markdown. So Markdown is, sort of a markup, which is converted to HTML on the runtime, on the build time. And I use Markdown everywhere. You can use MDX, you can use, Pug, Mustache, Handlebar, whichever fits the build for you. I use Markdown everywhere. I use Markdown on GitHub to create the READMEs. I use Markdown to write the emails, write my newsletters, write my blog post. And even right now, what you are looking at is a Go language-based presentation template that I built. And I only had to write Markdown for this particular area that you see. This is all generated through Markdown. I don't need to create this again and again for every presentation that I do. Markdown is really good. You should definitely invest more time in learning it. Okay, now that I had understood what Jamstack really means, I wanted to start looking at what was not really trending, but what would fit really well with my use case here. What I really needed from my front end was a really good first-class routing support. So I can send anyone to anyone's demo page really quickly and have more control on how that demo page is built. For example, my page would be cloudycam.dev/avast. I wanted more control on this page in this route. I also needed server-side rendering along with the static-side generation. I wanted to use my server because otherwise what was happening was I was stuck with 2 to 3 minutes of build time every single time a new demo was created. And remember, I had a budget of 15 seconds per demo page. And a good to have here was a progressive web app support. So I went out to the community and I started to look for the options, and everyone was kind of recommending Next.js. Gatsby has this impressive documentation and this support for React and GraphQL. But what I felt was missing in Gatsby was routing support. You see, routing is sort of a second-tier citizen in Gatsby, and that was not really fitting well with the model that I had been building. It was not scaling well with the Jamstack. A little bit more research, and I end up with Next.js. And to my surprise, Next.js has more stargazers on GitHub than Gatsby.js. Maybe this is something you care about. Or maybe if you take a look at built with, I probably saw that Next.js was being used for more dynamic websites than the static ones, but it had this hybrid nature. It has a very well thought out routing support that was, from where I stood, it felt right. It was done right. And then it has what we call a hybrid Jamstack. So you can either build a particular page statically with their static site generator, or you can use their static part generator to dynamically fetch different pages at the build time, and then fall back to server-side rendering, which is amazing. For example, let me show you how. So in Next.js, they have React components-based pages. For example, if you go into the Next.js pages directory and create an about.js page, which would look like a simple React component like this, it would be readily available on the route of yourdomain.com/about. So a React component, a file-based React component, kind of translates to a route. And you can also do dynamic routes. For example, you could create something of this nature, where a post ID would generate post/1, post/2 page, and this square bracket thing kind of defines that this is a dynamic page. But what is really interesting about Next.js is how they understand that a dynamic application or an application that really needs to scale with a lot of data in it, they understand how data fetching would work there. They have these multiple options for generating your pages statically or from server side. So if you take a look at the documentation, Git Static Props is the idea where you create this function and return all of its data in the props. For example, let's say if this is where you are going to list all of your blog posts. So you create a Git Static function, you fetch all of your posts, and you return this post data as props, which is then consumed by this UI, and this UI would build this map of all of your posts. And this is not something that would happen on the server side. It would happen when you will be building your site. It would happen in a way that your site that is built by your builder, that is Next.js, it would be a static website. And then you can also use Git Static Paths. Let me show you what that is. So Git Static Paths is also a function where you actually define the paths that are needed to be static. For example, you can return these two paths with IDs 1 and 2. And for a page, a dynamic page with this brackets ID kind of name, it would use this function along with the Get Static Props function to bring in the API and produce these two pages, which would be called post 1 and post 2. So these two functions kind of go hand in hand. But what's really important here is in Git Static Paths, you can actually define a fallback parameter where you can kind of say, for example, let's say you had only 2 pages, you see, but what if a person wanted to visit posts/3? How would that happen? So that would happen if you would have set fallback to true and if you would handle it in a different way. Let me show you. Let me just quickly go over how that fallback page would work. For example, in Get Static Paths, you have imagine that you have fetched this data from an API, which has the information for page 1 and the page number 2. But the user is going to visit page number 3. So since the data that existed in our static paths, or when the website was built by Next.js, it did not build the third page, what would happen is it would go to that fallback being true. It would use our server side to create that page dynamically on the go. You see, you would use router.isFallback, and you would load that particular page right then and there when the a hit comes in, while your server is kind of producing that from your server side. And later on, you can go ahead and build this data. Once it's actually there, once the API is ready, it would be actually here. So your static side would have this statically generated page, and you wouldn't have to use fallback. I know what I just said is super confusing, but let me just summarize it a little bit. Imagine your API had just 2 pages, and the user went for the third page. Next.js data fetching would fetch that third page from your API using its server-side rendering, and the server would render that third page and give it to your user. And later on, your static site would generate that page statically. So for example, when that user comes back to this page, it actually exists as a static page, and the server is not used for that part. This is sort of what we call a hybrid Jamstack approach, a hybrid approach which allows you to scale your applications really well. You build something which is both static and dynamic only while it's needed to be dynamic, which becomes static later on. For example, to reduce the amount of time that is required to build my demo page in Cloudycam to 15 seconds, I would just use that dynamic page for that particular amount of time, while the actual builder behind the scene is building that page statically for the next 2 or 3 minutes. I hope you get this idea. It's pretty amazing how Next.js does this thing, and I definitely implore you to go ahead and check this out. Another example for this would be, imagine you're building a blog and you just want to quickly preview your post, how that draft post looks like. You don't really want to go ahead and build your entire website to be able to preview that blog. So with this fallback option, you can actually, and they actually have more options where you can actually build a preview in, where that preview would just ignore the static site builder and use the server-side rendering to build that preview on the server side using your server. Let's go back from the documentation here. So Next.js is what I settled with, and I'm still happy with it. It went out really good. Cloudycam has received about 500,000 page requests, and we've generated about 660 or something demo pages, and these demo pages are being generated in less than 15 seconds. And the entire experience is just really good. It has both static site and server-side rendering support. Plus minus progressive web app support, like everywhere, but I was able to easily build a progressive web app with Next.js. After all of these features, all of the requirements that I had behind the scenes, I pretty much believe that Next.js blows Gatsby.js out of its waters. Next.js is truly awesome on building dynamically generated and statically generated static sites with Jamstack, which is actually scalable. And for a better part of every Jamstack application that I've built, I've ended up needing some sort of scaling. Okay, now coming back to the backend option. What I needed was a serverless setup. I didn't want to manage a server for a small, developer activation demo like this. And similarly, like when you have a server, but you don't have to manage it, we call it serverless. Imagine having a backend that you don't really have to manage. And I think this is what we would call backend-less approach, which is also known as infrastructure as code, where you just write a bunch of code and your server is kind of built for you. And you don't really have to manage that server. You just say, okay, I need my Go API, Go language API to be built. I need my Python language API to be built and Node.js API language to be built. And all of the infrastructure that is needed to do these kind of things is done for you based on your code, not something you end up managing on your own or orchestrating your service. And a good to have was a monorepo. So what is a monorepo? A monorepo is where you put all of your code in one repository. For example, in this Jamstack demo, we had this private developer activation thingy, which I couldn't distribute using an npm package or whatnot. So I would just allow all of my team members to git clone this repository and start using it. This particular choice made it really easy because it was just one thing that they needed to do, but it kind of complicated the problem of building a monorepo. So what our repository had was all the API, all the backend stuff, all the frontend stuff, all the things related to documentation, all of it inside one single repo. So initially, I thought it would be good to have a backend which would be backend-less and serverless, and I wouldn't have to kind of manage it, and it would have monorepo support. Okay, but one thing I was missing here was I still needed to use something to actually manage the developer. How would you go about creating a new demo? You'd probably need a CMS, but doing this with a CMS kind of slowed things down for us. For example, if you take your images, if you take the images from your photographer and try to upload them in your CMS and publish a new page, it generally takes about 30 to 35 seconds if you have like fast fingers and if everything is in sync. But what I had was a budget of 15 seconds. I wanted to build that demo page under 15 seconds. So when you are done getting your pictures taken, your demo page is ready as well. So instead of depending on a CMS, I ended up building a Node.js-based CLI-based CMS. A CLI would do anything you want. For example, you would say your new demo page and it would create that demo page. Here are some of the demo commands that I can probably show you. For example, if you would create your new OS, it would go ahead, fetch the images that were taken from the DSLR, let's say the last 3 images using our cool setup with Raspberry Pi and whatnot. And it would then use those images resize them with the Node.js and JavaScript APIs, and kind of put or upload them to Cloudering. Then I'll get those images URLs hosted on a CDN with Cloudering, and I would create this Jamstack application demo page with Next.js through the CLI that would be hosted on cloudycam.dev/avs. You see, these are a lot of steps, and I needed to be able to do these in less than 15 seconds. That is why I depended on building the CLI based on Node.js, where you just do your new avs, and it takes these 3 images and do all of this and creates a cloudycam.dev avs page for you. And you could also do fun stuff with it. For example, let's imagine having a demo with 2 people who got 2 pictures taken at the same time with 2 persons in one picture. So what would you do is you would just run the duplicate command and duplicate a particular demo page and create a new one. For example, this avs demo page that we had created here would now also have another duplicate page called cloudycam.dev/ahmad. It worked out really well building a Node.js CLI here. Now I needed something serverless, something backendless. And Zeit now is sort of a platform, which is, I would say, the parent company that helps support the development of Next.js. And it is a really cool, static hosting. It is something where you can actually use React.js, Vue.js, Node.js, even Go language-based APIs. It has almost no configuration support for monorepo, where you just build, you say, this is my API.go file, this is my API.py file for Python, this is my API.js file. It is going to be built using Node.js. And it would just go ahead and do that. And the serverless is, it also has the concept of serverless functions. Let me show you how. For example, for Next.js, in the pages directory, you create a directory called API. Every file in that in this particular directory of API becomes your actual API endpoint. For example, let's imagine having a file called getuser.ts for TypeScript. I forgot to mention that Next.js comes with a built-in support for TypeScript. And that is sort of where I kind of want to go from here, that Next.js kind of does everything for you. You don't need to manage React or Webpack or TypeScript support or support of these serverless functions in backend or whatnot. The performance is sort of really built in. You generate a React-based application, which is performant by default. The CSS is chunk-sized. You're only loading the CSS that is needed for your particular page. You're only loading the JavaScript required there. And then there's fallback support for your React application to become a sort of a single-page application when there's JavaScript support, and then fall back to a complete static site if you want it to. And you coming back to this API point, imagine this page. You can just use now Node Builder in the request and response and respond to this as a JSON with the user data by using your database or whatnot. And this would just build, your API page using Node.js. And a user would be able to visit this endpoint by going through /API/get-user, which we actually build. And it would this particular data would be returned to the user using JSON, the one we kind of just. I wouldn't have to manage anything here, nothing, no, nada, zilch, zip. File-based routing to create serverless functions of your API as well as endpoints. Come at me. I really like this thing. Whereas I believe they also have this thing called builds, which is sort of a bit deprecated in favor of functions. But I ended up using this to support my monorepo, where you can define a particular path and tell now to only use it or only generate it using the static site builder or the static site generator that they have. And then you can define other paths to be able to build using, Python or Go language or Node or whatever you want. So that is how I ended up choosing Zeit now. Excellent support for monorepo, for deploying any kind of React or JavaScript or Node or Go language application. And it would generate a preview or URLs for every branch, every pull request on the go, which would make it really easy for us to kind of test things when we were building it, when we were developing. Okay, the one last problem that I had to deal with was documentation. So as you are right now, I was also pretty much tired of spending so much time on a really small project, which was not something of a mainstream, just a demo that we do in front of our developer friends. So I didn't want to invest a lot of time in building the UI. I wanted something that would support documentation in Markdown, which would have a good documentation UI, but it would allow me to make it, it would be customizable. It would allow me to make some customization. And a good to have in my mind was maybe if it had a built-in search support where I don't have to use any kind of SaaS or invest more money into it, that would be a lot of fun. I did a lot of research. I ended up with VuePress. It's a Vue-based static site documentation generator. A pretty amazing documentation it has. And just a prefix here, I'm not a Vue developer. I love React. I build things in React. And I use VuePress without ever having to use Vue at all. I know I could have used Vue if I want to, but it makes it really easy to use. VuePress makes it really easy to be used by anyone. You don't have to be a Vue.js developer to use VuePress. And then it builds your static side, your documentation, which is not really dependent on JavaScript. It kind of oozes out all of the HTML content, which is very much appreciated by your search engine rewards that would index your documentation, and you would start getting more and more organic traffic. It supports Markdown out of the box and really has a really good search functionality built in. Let me show you how. For example, in Markdown support, you can do a lot of things. You can have, you could just write this to generate a table of content by installing these Markdown extensions from VuePress documentation. And these custom containers thingies that I really like, for example, you would define a syntax like this, and it would generate this cool looking output for your tips, warnings, and whatnot. And here, as I have already shown you, this is what my documentation looked like for Cloudycam. This is actually built with VuePress. You see how cool it looks. I didn't have to build this UI, but I still ended up, customizing a lot of it. For example, this particular syntax color, you see, if you are using my shades of purple theme, you probably would have already guessed it that my documentation uses my own shades of purple theme. Vue.js allows you to use Prism CSS, and I just put Prism CSS inside the configuration, and VuePress just did everything for me. It also comes with really cool features like you can just go ahead and edit this page on GitHub, and it also kind of figures out when was this page last updated and what. Even without having my support, my manager went ahead and contributed a Markdown-based document on a wireless setup from camera to laptop without my support. And it just worked. You can see it, how cool it looks, and these battery power indicators, these steps and whatnot. It did really make a lot of sense. And then the search support, for example, if you are looking for the delete command, if you write del here and press enter, here you are. Inside the commands, there's the del command. So it really felt really well. If you want to use a documentation site that is statically built using Jamstack, you can probably build it with VuePress and host it anywhere on Zeit, Netlify, even on Amazon with AWS Amplifier. It's really cool that this VuePress documentation site has worked it out and has received a lot of traffic as well. And that was pretty much it. I had actually built a Jamstack application, which kind of is a hybrid approach, has both static and dynamic components to it, and use monorepo with Zeit now to put it all together and produce this awesome developer activation. To this date, we have received about 500,000 users on this particular developer activation. We have built over 600 demo pages, and it still hasn't costed us a penny. It is that cheap, and the performance is just built in. We started ranking for the term of Cloudycam at the very top of Google. Yeah, a lot of our pages are already indexed in the Google, and then our documentation is really appreciated both from my managers, both from my colleagues, and it just looks good. I definitely ask you to kind of implore this Jamstack idea beyond what the trend looks like, beyond what everyone seems to be doing, and really go out there and start building these hybrid applications which are performant by default, and where you end up with less security issues, less hosting costs, and kind of consider the developer experience as well as the operational experience. So you don't end up generating your entire website statically only when you added one single page, especially for pages that you are going to need really quickly, like I did. And that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, go ahead, tweet them out to me at Mr. Ahmedawes. I'll make a best effort to reply to everyone. And I'm going to be sharing the link to these slides on my Twitter ID. Go ahead, follow me there, and I'll see you there. Bye.